The clock on the wall in the small kitchen read 10:45 p.m. The scent of warmed stroopwafels still lingered in the air, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. Inge was clearing the plates alone, while Lars lay sprawled on the sofa in the living room, laughing loudly at something on the television. He held a beer bottle in his hand, leaving damp marks on the worn armrest. "Are you planning to stay there all night?" Inge asked, her voice calm but carrying a weariness that echoed in every word. Lars didn't even glance away from the screen. "It's just a game. You need to relax. Besides, you're better at this house stuff anyway." Inge took a deep breath, swallowing the anger that threatened to boil over. This wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. While she spent endless hours working at a cheese shop in the center of Utrecht, Lars spent his days at the bar with friends or sleeping until noon. His excuse was always the same: he was still looking for something bigger. When Marij, Lars' mother, arrived unannounced that evening, the situation became even more unbearable. "Still tidying up, Inge? You really should be more organized. Lars deserves a home that inspires him, you know," Marij said, her tone dripping with condescension as she nibbled on a piece of stroopwafel. Inge gripped the dishcloth tightly, her fingers trembling. She wanted to respond, wanted to shout that she was doing everything possible to keep the house running. But instead, she simply nodded, as she always did. She knew Marij would find new ways to criticize her, and Lars wouldn't lift a finger to defend her. That night, while Lars snored on the sofa and Marij finally left, Inge locked herself in the bathroom. The mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized, deep circles under her eyes, hair hastily tied into a messy bun, and a lifeless gaze. Why did she stay? The question haunted her constantly. The answer was always the same: because she loved him. But what kind of love made her feel so small? The anguish weighed heavily on her chest as she remembered her youth, the dreams she had before meeting Lars. It all seemed so far away now, like a life she no longer knew how to reach. A few days later, during a typical family dinner, things reached a new level of humiliation. Marij dominated the conversation, filled with criticism and subtle digs at Inge's role as a wife. Lars, sitting beside her, laughed at the jokes, oblivious, or indifferent, to their impact on his wife. As Inge got up to fetch more coffee, she overheard something that froze her in place. "She's lucky to have you, Lars," Marij said with a smile. "A woman like her wouldn't have many options." "Lucky?" Lars replied, chuckling. "Sometimes I think I should have made a better choice." The coffee cup in Inge's hand trembled. She couldn't tell if it was from anger, sadness, or humiliation. The sound of their laughter echoed in her ears as she stepped out into the garden, desperate for air. Outside, the cold Utrecht breeze hit her face like a slap. The lights from the neighboring houses glimmered in the distance, and the night silence seemed to mock her agony. She hugged her arms tightly across her chest, trying to hold herself together. Then, she heard a voice behind her. "Inge? Are you all right?" She turned to see Erik, Lars' childhood friend, standing there with an unlit cigarette between his fingers and a look of genuine concern. "I saw you come out. You looked like you needed a moment." Inge's eyes filled with tears, but she held them back. "I'm fine, just needed some air." "You don't look fine," Erik said gently, his tone calm in contrast to the turmoil inside her. He hesitated before adding, "You deserve better, you know that." His words hit her like a bolt of lightning. It had been so long since anyone said something like that to her. For the first time in years, Inge felt something shift, a flicker of hope. Erik held her gaze for a moment longer before saying, almost in a whisper, "If you ever need someone, I'm here. Always have been." Inge didn't respond, but those words stayed with her as she returned to the house. Inside, Lars was still laughing with Marij, oblivious to the crumbling world around him. Something changed that night. Though Inge couldn't yet name what she felt, she knew a transformation had begun. The timid Utrecht sun peeked through the clouds, painting the sky in shades of orange as Inge hurried along the cobblestone streets. The cheese shop was already bustling, as usual. She busied herself serving curious tourists and locals who cherished fresh Gouda, yet her mind wandered to the events of the previous night. Erik's words echoed in her mind, "I've always been here." It was as though he had touched something deep within her, something she had buried long ago. Conflicting emotions bubbled to the surface, shame for feeling so moved, but also a strange comfort she hadn't experienced in years. Daily life consumed her, but the upcoming family gathering resurfaced the weight of her marriage. It was Sunday, and, as usual, Marriage had organized lunch. Freshly baked stroopwafels were stacked on the table alongside freshly brewed coffee, but the atmosphere was anything but warm. Marriage's critical gaze followed Inge as she poured the coffee. "I didn't know you still wore that dress, Inge," she remarked with a false smile. "It seems a bit snug." Lars laughed, not even trying to hide it. "She has a real talent for that, doesn't she, Mum?" Inge's face burned, but she kept her composure. She knew reacting would only fuel their taunts. As she tried to focus on anything else, the words began to sting like invisible splinters. Then she overheard something that made her heart stop. "Do you think she's even trying anymore?" Marriage whispered to Lars, chuckling. "I think she gave up a long time ago." Lars, in that mocking tone she knew too well, replied, "Well, I know I have." Inge stood abruptly, the sound of her chair scraping the floor cutting through the room. "I'm going to get some air," she murmured without looking at anyone, leaving behind the sweet aroma of stroopwafels and the weight of their laughter echoing in the walls. Outside, the garden was bathed in golden light. The tulips, vibrant in their beauty, did nothing to lift the heaviness in Inge's heart. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to steady the torrent of emotions threatening to consume her. "Inge?" Eric's voice was soft yet firm, pulling her back to the moment. She turned, surprised to see him again. He held a half-empty bottle of beer, but his expression was serious. "Are you all right?" he asked, stepping closer. She tried to smile, but her face refused to cooperate. "Yes. I just needed a moment of peace." Eric nodded, studying her for a moment before saying, "It seems like you need that a lot lately." His words caught her off guard, but she didn't deny it. She couldn't. "And you?" she asked, trying to shift the focus. "What are you doing out here?" "Lars asked me to stop by." "I didn't realize that meant watching his mother torment you while he laughs." Inge felt tears welling up again, but she quickly blinked them away. "It's nothing. I'm used to it." "You shouldn't be," Eric said with unexpected intensity. He hesitated, as though struggling with his words, before finally adding, "You used to be so full of life, Inge. Always so vibrant. It's hard to see you like this." She averted her eyes, ashamed, but didn't respond. The silence between them was heavy, yet not uncomfortable. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen. Eric leaned in slightly, his gaze fixed on hers. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," she replied, uncertain. "Why are you still with him?" The question hit her like a punch to the stomach. She wanted to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, the cruel truth twisted in her throat. She didn't know. Was it love? Fear? The belief that she didn't deserve anything more? Eric continued, his voice gentler now. "I'm not asking to judge you. I just want you to know that there are other ways to live." His words hung in the air like a promise. Inge looked at him, her eyes filled with confusion and pain, but also with something new, hope. Before she could reply, Marriage appeared in the doorway, disapproval etched across her face. "Inge, the coffee's getting cold. And you know how Lars hates to wait." Inge didn't move for a moment, torn between the oppressive familiarity inside the house and the uncertain possibility represented by Eric. "I'm coming," she finally replied, her voice heavy with resignation. But as she walked back inside, one thing was clear, that conversation had planted something within her. And even though she couldn't yet name it, she knew she could no longer ignore it. The night in Utrecht was cold, and the house was steeped in an uncomfortable silence. Lars sat in his armchair, distracted by his phone, while Inge stood in the kitchen washing up after dinner. The television murmured in the background, a mix of Dutch adverts blending with the clinking of bottles against the sink. "You could at least help me, Lars," she said, her tone more weary than irritated. "I'm busy, Inge," he replied, not lifting his eyes. "Besides, you always complain that I do it wrong." She wanted to argue back, but she knew it would be pointless. She didn't have the energy for yet another argument that would end in frustration and solitary tears. Instead, she turned her focus back to the dishes, her thoughts drifting to her conversation with Eric. There was something about that moment, the way he had looked at her, that felt different. As Inge tried to ignore the weight of her dissatisfaction, Lars lit a cigarette, exhaling smoke lazily into the room. "You know you're not supposed to smoke inside," she said firmly, though without raising her voice. "Relax, I'll open a window later," he replied dismissively. He placed the cigarette in the ashtray and left the room, leaving the television on. Inge glanced at the ashtray with disdain, her frustration growing. He was like an overgrown child, incapable of taking responsibility or seeing beyond himself. Moments later, the smell of smoke changed. It was no longer the acrid tang of a cigarette, but something heavier, more alarming. Inge's heart raced as she turned to the living room. Small flames were licking the edge of the sofa where Lars had carelessly left his cigarette. "Lars!" she screamed, grabbing a bucket of water. The flames spread quickly, fueled by the old fabric of the sofa and the papers scattered on the table. Lars appeared, but instead of helping, he froze in place. "Do something!" Inge yelled, trying to smother the fire with a blanket. He stepped back, his hands in his hair. I don't know what to do." Smoke began to fill the room, making Inge cough as she struggled to open the windows. The heat was suffocating, and the roaring sound of the fire seemed to consume everything around her. "Get out!" she shouted, pushing Lars toward the door. He hesitated for a moment before bolting outside, leaving her alone with the flames. Fear and anger churned in her chest. She knew she needed to leave, but something held her back, a refusal to abandon everything she had built. As she fought her way toward the door, strong arms pulled her back. She turned, and even through the dense smoke, she recognized Eric. "Are you crazy? What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Saving you," he shouted, wrapping her in a coat and guiding her out of the burning house. Outside, Inge gasped for the cold air, her throat burning. Eric collapsed beside her, coughing, and she noticed then that he was hurt. A burn stretched along his arm, and his face was streaked with soot. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her trembling hands cupping his face. "Because you deserve to live," he said, his eyes locked on hers. Lars stood a few meters away, watching silently. His expression was a mixture of shock and shame, but he didn't approach. By the time the firefighters arrived, Lars had already disappeared into the darkness. Inge sat beside Eric, watching the flames devour her house. The fire seemed to represent more than just material destruction, it was the end of something. And the beginning of something else she couldn't yet fully understand. The days following the fire blurred into a haze of uncertainty and forced change. Inge found temporary refuge at the home of a colleague from the cheese shop, while Lars vanished without a trace. His absence was both a relief and a difficult blow to process. Her small suitcase, packed with the few belongings salvaged from the fire, felt like a reflection of her life, scarred by destruction, yet still intact. Though the burn on her face was just beginning to heal physically, it was the emotional wound that seemed far harder to mend. Eric, recovering from the burns on his arm, stayed by Inge's side. He called every morning to check on her and offered his help whenever possible. One day, he appeared at the door of her temporary apartment holding a small bouquet of yellow tulips. "I know you didn't ask for this," he said, looking slightly embarrassed, "but I thought it might brighten the place up." For the first time in weeks, Inge smiled. "They are beautiful." "Thank you." He studied her face, his gaze calm and unjudging. The scar running from her cheek to her jawline was still pink and tender, but unlike others, Eric never seemed to focus on it. "Have you thought about talking to someone?" he asked hesitantly. "Not just about the scar, but everything?" "A therapist, you mean?" she replied, surprised. "Yes. I know it's not easy, but you've been through a lot, Inge. You don't have to face it all on your own." His words struck her with a mix of relief and resistance. She had always carried her burdens alone, but maybe, just maybe, he was right. The following week, Inge found the courage to schedule her first therapy session. Sitting in a warm room with soft-colored walls, she began to untangle the knots of her story with a therapist whose gentle voice guided her. Speaking about Lars, about marriage, about years of humiliation, felt like reopening a wound that had never healed properly. Yet, little by little, she realized something. The scar on her face was a visible mark, but the invisible wounds she carried in her heart were far deeper. As the weeks passed, subtle changes began to emerge in Inge. She started to see herself differently, not just as someone who had suffered, but as someone who had survived. The scar that she once viewed as a punishment began to feel like a symbol of resilience. Eric remained by her side, ever patient, ever considerate. One day, while they strolled through a nearby park, she admitted, "It's strange, you know? For so long, I thought my worth depended on what Lars thought of me. Now, I'm trying to figure out who I really am." Eric stopped walking and looked at her. "And who are you discovering?" She smiled faintly. "Someone stronger than I imagined." That evening, as they returned to her temporary home, Eric walked her to the door. Before saying goodbye, he hesitated. "Inge, I need to tell you something." She waited, curious. "For a long time, I've felt something for you. But I never said anything because I knew the situation you were in." His words lingered in the air, and Inge felt her heart race. It wasn't a grand, dramatic confession, but it was honest. And that, to her, meant everything. She didn't respond immediately but placed her hand lightly on his arm, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Thank you for telling me." As Eric walked away into the evening, Inge closed the door, her heart in turmoil. Yet, amidst the confusion, a new feeling began to grow within her, the sense that, for the first time, she had a choice. The months that followed brought changes Inge never thought possible. Gradually, she found stability in a new routine. Her days were a balance between working at the cheese shop, attending therapy sessions, and enjoying quiet moments with Eric, who had become a constant and natural part of her life. Inge no longer saw herself as a shadow of someone else. With Eric by her side, she began rediscovering pieces of herself that had been lost during years of hardship. The scar on her face, once a cruel reminder of her pain, was now something she accepted as part of her story, a symbol of resilience and survival. One afternoon, while walking along a canal lined with tulips, Eric broke the silence. "Have you ever thought about doing something just for yourself? Something you've always wanted but never had the chance to do?" Inge laughed, caught off guard by the question. "I don't know. I guess I've never really allowed myself that freedom." "Maybe it's time you did," he replied. The conversation lingered in her mind, planting a seed of curiosity. Later, during a therapy session, Inge admitted how much she still struggled to feel deserving of happiness. "Happiness isn't something you have to earn, Inge," her therapist said gently. "It's something you build, step by step." Inspired by these words, Inge made a decision: she would organize something to celebrate her new life. Not as a way to forget the past, but as a milestone marking who she was becoming. With Eric's help, Inge planned an intimate ceremony at a small windmill by a canal. They chose a spring day, when the tulips were in full bloom, and the surrounding fields were a sea of vibrant colors. Close friends and colleagues gathered to witness the occasion. Inge wore a simple yet elegant dress that made her feel more confident than ever. The scar on her face, softened by time and treatments, was still visible, but she didn't hide it. It was part of her, and she embraced it without shame. As a gentle breeze swept across the fields, Eric took her hand and looked into her eyes. "You've taught me what true strength is," he said, his voice steady. "And you've shown me that love isn't about changing who we are, but about supporting each other to grow." His words resonated deeply with Inge. As they exchanged vows, she felt, for the first time, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. After the ceremony, as the small group of guests celebrated with local wine and stroop waffles, Inge looked around and felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: gratitude. Not just for those around her, but for herself. She had endured more than she ever thought possible, and now she was living the reward of her strength. Eric leaned close to her, his calm smile radiating warmth. "This is your new life, Inge. And I'm so happy to be part of it," he whispered. She smiled back, squeezing his hand. This wasn't just the beginning of a marriage, it was the start of a life she had chosen for herself, a life no longer defined by shadows, but by light and love. The morning was fresh and sunny as Inge, Eric, and their 2-year-old daughter, Noor, strolled through a local market in Gouda. The air was filled with the rich aroma of aged cheeses, freshly baked bread, and handcrafted waffles, creating a vibrant and inviting atmosphere. Noor swung her little legs in the stroller, pointing excitedly at the colorful balloons decorating the market stalls. Inge felt light. Moments like this, surrounded by life's simple joys and the love of her new family, acted as a soothing balm for the invisible scars she still carried. She was learning to accept her past as part of her journey, but she never imagined it would resurface so unexpectedly. While selecting a wheel of aged Gouda, a voice behind her froze her in place. "Inge?" She turned slowly, and there he was, Lars. Her former husband was almost unrecognizable. The confident, dismissive man she once knew now had sunken eyes, rumpled clothes, and a look that wavered between shame and desperation. "I can't believe it's you," he said, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's been so long." Inge took a deep breath, steadying herself against the surge of emotions that hit her, anger, pity, and even a faint flicker of nostalgia. Eric noticed her unease and silently stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on her back. I need to talk to you, Inge," Lars said, his eyes darting to Eric and then to Noor, as though only now realizing her presence. "I'm not sure there's much to say, Lars," Inge replied, a voice calm in a way that surprised her. But Lars persisted, his expression pleading. "I messed up. I know I did, and, believe it or not, I'm sorry." Those words unlocked a flood of memories that Inge had worked hard to box away, the humiliation, the lonely nights, the fire. Above all, the crushing sense of invisibility. She looked at Lars, searching for traces of the man she once loved, but all she saw was the weight of his wrong choices. "I'm sorry for how things ended," she said sincerely. "But you made your choice, Lars. And I made mine." He nodded, seeming to wrestle with his own guilt. "You seem happy. I'm glad for you. Truly." There was something genuine in his voice, but Inge knew it didn't erase what he had put her through. Still, she recognized the moment for what it was, an opportunity to leave the past where it belonged. When Lars asked for help, admitting that he was struggling to rebuild his life, Inge realized she had a decision to make. She could involve herself in his life again, risking the stability she had worked so hard to achieve, or she could choose to move forward and protect the new life she had built. After a pause, she said, "I hope you find what you need to turn your life around, Lars. But I'm not the person who can help you." His shoulders slumped, but he nodded slowly, as though accepting that this was the end. "Thank you, Inge," he said before turning and disappearing into the crowd of stalls. As Lars vanished, Inge felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Eric wrapped his arms around her, and Noor, oblivious to the moment, giggled as she reached out towards a vendor offering samples of cheese. Inge smiled at her daughter, then at Eric, feeling lighter than she had in years. That encounter had closed a chapter in her life. There were no lingering emotional debts, no need to carry the pain of the past any longer. She was free. "Are you all right?" Eric asked, gently stroking her cheek. "Yes," Inge said with conviction. "For the first time in a long time, everything is all right." As they continued walking through the market, Inge realized the past no longer had power over her. Her life was now built on love, respect, and the conscious choice to embrace happiness. The Gouda market resembled a scene from a postcard. Inge held Noor's tiny hand while Eric pushed their shopping cart brimming with cheeses, bread, and traditional sweets. The vibrant colors of the stalls and the cheerful chatter around them created an atmosphere of warmth and ease, though within Inge, a quiet storm lingered. The encounter with Lars still echoed in her mind. It wasn't the weight of his presence, but what he symbolized, a past she had left behind yet still cast a faint shadow. As she watched Eric entertain Noor, making her giggle with his playful voices, Inge felt a deep sense of comfort. She had everything she needed now, not because someone had rescued her, but because she had chosen herself. That evening, as Noor slept in her crib and the house rested in serene silence, Inge sat at the table with a cup of tea. The calming aroma of chamomile filled the air as she gazed out the window, where the canal reflected the streetlights like a living painting. Eric appeared, draping a blanket over her shoulders. "Thinking about Lars?" he asked gently, his tone direct but considerate. Inge shook her head. "Not exactly. Thinking about who I was when I was with him." Eric sat beside her, patient as she sifted through her thoughts. "I've realized that I was always searching for validation, from Lars, from marriage, even from myself, but in a cruel way, like I had to suffer to prove my worth." She paused, her gaze fixed on the teacup in her hands. "Now I see that my worth was never in anyone else. It's always been here, with me. I just needed time to recognize it." Eric took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "You're the strongest person I've ever known, Inge. And whatever happened before only shaped the incredible person you are today." She smiled, feeling more connected to herself than ever. The past was a story already written, but she was now the author of her future. Inge walked to the mirror in the hallway, studying her reflection. The scar on her face remained, though it had faded over time. She ran her fingers lightly over the skin, no longer feeling the shame that once consumed her. "This scar isn't just a mark," she said aloud, to herself and Eric. "It's a reminder that I survived." Eric smiled, silently acknowledging her words. He knew some things didn't need a reply. The following weekend, Inge and Eric took Noah for a stroll through the park. The day was clear, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of tulip fields in the distance. Noah ran ahead, laughing as she chased butterflies fluttering around her. As they walked side by side, Inge turned to Eric. "I never thought I could be this happy." "You deserve this and so much more, Inge," he replied. The sound of Noah's laughter drew them back into the moment. Inge realized that the past no longer mattered. The only thing that did was the life unfolding before her, a life filled with love, acceptance, and freedom. As the sun set on the horizon, casting golden hues over the canal, Inge squeezed Eric's hand and watched her daughter play. For the first time, she felt whole. She knew that, despite the scars of her past, she had been reborn stronger and more complete. And as they walked home together, she felt she had not only closed a cycle but also begun a new chapter, one where she was, at last, the protagonist of her own story.